"Do you know what you look like standing in my building, Marcus?" Richard Carter's voice cut across the quiet office like a knife. "You look like a man who wandered in from the wrong side of the tracks, wearing construction boots in a place meant for people who actually build the future." He leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with open contempt. "Saving my daughter doesn't suddenly make you one of us." A slow pause. "A stray dog can jump in front of a car, too. That doesn't make him part of the family." His eyes hardened. "So, understand something clearly. Gratitude has limits, and men like you need to know exactly where those limits are." Marcus Reed didn't react. At 32 years old, Marcus Reed was a tall, black construction worker, his broad shoulders shaped by years of carrying steel beams and heavy concrete across job sites throughout New York City. His jacket still carried the dust of a long shift, and his hands were rough from work most people in this city never noticed. Across from him stood Richard Carter, 58 years old, a powerful white real estate developer whose company had built many of Manhattan's skyscrapers. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his tailored suit immaculate. Richard Carter was used to controlling rooms and people. Standing nearby was Victor Lang, Carter Development's chief financial officer, a thin white man in his 40s with a quiet smile that suggested he enjoyed watching others struggle. Victor glanced down at Marcus's boots. "Well," he said casually, "this is definitely the first time we've had construction dust on the executive floor." Marcus stayed silent. Victor continued, amused. "You know what surprises me most? That you actually came here." He gestured toward the skyline outside the glass wall. "Buildings like those are designed by engineers, architects, investors." Then he looked back at Marcus. "Not the people pouring the concrete." Richard chuckled, softly. The humiliation was deliberate. Marcus understood that. Richard stood and walked around his desk. "You've been meeting my daughter." "It wasn't a question," Marcus answered calmly. "She wanted to thank me." Richard laughed once. "My daughter is an architecture student at Columbia University. She will design buildings that reshape this city." Then he gestured toward Marcus. "And you carry materials up scaffolding." Victor folded his arms. "So let's skip the sentimental part," he said. "Mr. Carter is asking you to stay away from Emily." Marcus met Richard's eyes. "I never asked for anything." Richard's expression hardened. "You asked the moment you allowed her to believe you belong anywhere near her life." Marcus's voice stayed steady. "I saved her life." Richard leaned closer. "And that earns you a thank you. Not a seat at my table." The room went silent. Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand," Victor smirked. "Good, because men who don't understand usually regret it." Marcus turned toward the door, but Richard spoke again. And Marcus stopped. Richard's voice dropped cold. "Heroes don't last long in this city." Marcus didn't respond. He simply walked out. 2 weeks earlier. Winter air rushed through the underground platform of a Manhattan subway station. Commuters waited quietly for the evening train. Marcus Reed leaned against a steel column, his construction helmet clipped to his belt. 12 hours of work had left his shoulders aching and his hands stiff from cold metal. Across the platform stood a young woman checking her phone. Emily Carter, 24 years old, white, an architecture graduate student, wrapped in a long brown coat as she waited for the train. She looked tired. Her fingers trembled slightly. Then suddenly, her vision blurred. Emily staggered, before anyone understood what was happening. She collapsed forward. Her body fell straight onto the subway. Tracks. Gasps erupted across the platform. Someone screamed. "Oh my God!" The distant roar of the train echoed through the tunnel. Headlights appeared. The train was seconds away. People froze. Phones lifted. But no one moved, except Marcus. His boots slammed against the platform edge. In one motion, he jumped onto the tracks. The train horn blasted. Emily lay unconscious. Marcus grabbed her arms and dragged her toward the narrow safety trench between the rails. The train thundered closer. There was no time. Marcus pulled her into the trench and wrapped his body over hers. The train roared above them. Steel screamed. Wind blasted through the tunnel. For several seconds, the world became thunder and vibration. Then the train screeched to a stop, and the crowd realized something impossible. Marcus Reed and Emily Carter were still alive. Emily slowly opened her eyes. Her head rested against Marcus's shoulder. "What, happened?" she whispered. Marcus helped her sit up. "You fainted." Above them, stunned commuters stared down. Someone whispered, "He saved her." Emily looked at Marcus in disbelief. "You jumped?" Marcus shrugged lightly. Didn't think about it. Emily studied him. Then she smiled faintly. "Well, I guess I owe you my life." Marcus helped her climb back onto the platform. Emily glanced down at the name stitched on his jacket. "Marcus Reed." She looked up again. "Thank you." Marcus nodded politely. Then he turned and headed toward the subway stairs. Within seconds, he disappeared into the crowd. But Emily Carter kept watching the place where he vanished, because something about the quiet construction worker who had just saved her life felt different, like the beginning of a story she didn't understand yet. Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. John 7:24. If you have ever seen someone judged only by their appearance, then what happens next with Marcus Reed will make you rethink everything about power, truth, and respect. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay with Black Resilient Stories to follow the moment when the man they humiliated becomes the only person who can save their billion-dollar empire. Because the next time Marcus Reed walks into Richard Carter's office, it won't be about a daughter. It will be about a skyscraper that's about to collapse. The glass doors of Carter Development Headquarters closed behind Marcus Reed with a soft click. Outside, Manhattan buzzed with the restless energy of late afternoon traffic. But inside the skyscraper lobby, everything felt controlled. Polished marble floors, quiet footsteps, people speaking in calm corporate tones. Marcus adjusted the strap of his work bag and headed toward the exit. The meeting with Richard Carter still echoed in his mind. Heroes don't last long in this city. Marcus stepped outside into the cold wind and walked toward the subway. For him, the conversation was finished, but the story wasn't. 3 days later, Emily Carter stood inside a quiet university architecture studio surrounded by blueprints and glowing computer screens. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Stacks of design models covered the long work table, tiny glass towers, steel frameworks, miniature city blocks. Emily stared at the massive digital blueprint glowing on her laptop, her father's newest project. The Orion Tower, a 70-story skyscraper rising in the heart of Manhattan. It was supposed to be Carter Development's greatest achievement, but something wasn't right. The wind simulation on the screen flickered again. Red warning lines flashed across the structure. Emily frowned. That doesn't make sense. She ran the simulation again. The result was worse. Under certain wind conditions, the tower's upper structure swayed dangerously. Not enough to collapse immediately, but enough to trigger severe structural stress. Over time, it could become catastrophic. Emily leaned back in her chair. The tower had been reviewed by dozens of engineers. How could something this serious slip through? She grabbed her phone. There was only one person she trusted to look at the problem differently. Later that evening, Marcus Reed wiped concrete dust from his hands as the construction crew finished packing equipment at a building site in Queens. The sun was already sinking behind the skyline. His phone buzzed. He looked down. Emily Carter. Marcus hesitated. After the conversation with her father, he knew this was dangerous territory, but curiosity won. He answered. "Hey!" Emily's voice came quickly. "Marcus, I need your help." Marcus leaned against a steel beam. "What kind of help?" "It's about a building design." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Emily, I know," she interrupted. "I know what my father said. This isn't about that." Her voice sounded tense. "It's about Orion Tower." Marcus frowned slightly. He had seen the project rising downtown, its steel frame already dominating part of the skyline. "What about it?" "There's something wrong with the structure," Emily said. Marcus didn't respond immediately. "Can you meet me?" she asked. Marcus looked around the quiet construction site. Part of him wanted to say no, but something in Emily's voice sounded different. Not curious, worried. "All right," he said. "Where?" An hour later, Marcus stepped into the architecture studio. Emily waved him over immediately. "Thanks for coming." Marcus set his bag down. "So, what's the emergency?" Emily turned her laptop toward him. "This is the tower design." Marcus studied the screen. Even at first glance, he could tell the project was enormous. Steel support cores, reinforced central columns, layered wind dampening systems. Marcus leaned closer. "Run the simulation again." Emily clicked the command. The digital tower began swaying under simulated wind pressure. Marcus watched quietly. Then something caught his attention. His eyes narrowed. "Pause it." Emily stopped the simulation. Marcus pointed to the central support section. "That brace shouldn't be there." Emily blinked. "What?" "That diagonal reinforcement," Marcus said. "It's in the wrong position." Emily leaned forward. "But that's part of the structural update from last year." Marcus shook his head slowly. "No." He grabbed a pencil and sketched quickly on a blank sheet of paper. "The load distribution doesn't work like this." He tapped the drawing. "If the wind hits the tower from the west, that brace forces stress into the upper structure." Emily stared at the screen again. Her heart began to race. "You're saying the tower was designed wrong?" Marcus hesitated. Then he shook his head again. "No." He pointed at the blueprint. "The original design probably worked." Emily felt a chill. "Probably?" Marcus zoomed into the blueprint revision log. Multiple design updates appeared on the screen. Most were normal engineering changes, but one entry stood out. A late-stage structural revision. Marcus studied it carefully. Then he leaned back slowly. "That's not a design mistake." Emily swallowed. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked at her. "That change weakens the entire structure." Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. "So, why would someone do that?" Marcus stared at the blueprint. Only one explanation made sense. Someone had altered the design deliberately, to sabotage the tower. Emily's mind raced. "But this is my father's biggest project," she said. "Why would anyone want to destroy it?" Marcus didn't answer immediately, because he had already noticed something else. The authorization code attached to the design revision. It wasn't from the engineering department. Marcus turned the laptop toward Emily. "Who controls financial approvals at Carter Development?" Emily frowned. "That would be the CFO." Marcus pointed at the authorization signature on the screen. A name appeared beside the revision. Victor Lang. Emily's stomach tightened. "That can't be right," she whispered. Marcus leaned back slowly. But deep down, he already understood something terrifying. The Orion Tower wasn't just flawed. Someone inside Carter Development had changed the design on purpose. And if the tower failed, Richard Carter's entire empire would collapse. The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity. Proverbs 11:3. The elevator doors slid open on the 52nd floor of Carter Development's headquarters. Marcus Reed stepped out into a hallway lined with glass walls and polished steel. Everything here reflected power: expensive paintings, soft lighting, quiet conversations spoken in controlled voices. Marcus glanced down at his work jacket. Dust still clung to the sleeves. He hadn't had time to change after leaving the construction site. Emily Carter walked beside him, holding a tablet filled with blueprints. "Just explain what you showed me last night," she said quietly. "The structural stress problem." Marcus nodded once. But he already knew what was waiting behind those conference room doors. Richard Carter had agreed to hear them out, reluctantly, which meant the room would be full of people who didn't want Marcus there. Emily pushed open the door. Inside, a dozen executives sat around a long glass table. At the head of the room stood Richard Carter. Beside him, leaning casually against the table, was Victor Lang. Every head turned when Marcus entered. The silence was immediate and uncomfortable. Victor's eyes dropped slowly to Marcus's boots. Then he smiled. "Well," Victor said, his voice echoing lightly across the room, "this is unexpected." Several executives exchanged glances. Marcus walked forward calmly. Emily placed the tablet on the table and projected the blueprint onto the wall screen. Richard folded his arms. "You said you found a problem with Orion Tower," he said to Emily. Emily nodded. "Yes." Richard's eyes shifted to Marcus. "And he's the one who found it?" Marcus didn't speak yet. Victor chuckled softly. This should be interesting. Emily pointed to the digital blueprint. The tower's upper support structure is experiencing excessive lateral stress during wind simulations, she explained. An engineer at the table frowned. That's impossible. We ran dozens of tests. Marcus finally stepped closer to the screen. Run the simulation again, he said. Victor raised an eyebrow. You're giving instructions now? Richard gestured to the engineer. Run it. The screen flickered as the wind simulation began. The digital tower swayed under pressure. At first, everything looked stable. Then warning lines flashed red across the upper structure. Murmurs spread across the room. Marcus pointed to the central support braces. That reinforcement beam is forcing stress upward instead of dispersing it. The lead engineer leaned forward. That beam was added during a structural revision. Marcus nodded. That's the problem. Victor laughed out loud. You're telling a room full of engineers that a laborer understands structural physics better than they do? A few people around the table smiled awkwardly. Marcus ignored the comment. He grabbed a marker and walked to the glass board beside the screen. With quick movements, he sketched a simplified version of the tower's core structure. If wind pressure hits the tower from the west, Marcus said, drawing arrows, the load transfers through the central brace. He tapped the diagram. But because that brace was moved, the stress pushes upward instead of downward. The room grew quieter. One engineer leaned forward slowly. That would create harmonic vibration. Another nodded. And structural fatigue over time. Victor clapped slowly. Fascinating. His smile widened. Except for one problem. Marcus looked at him. Victor pointed at the screen. That design change came from our engineering department after months of testing. He stepped closer. You're suggesting they all made a mistake? Marcus shook his head. No. Victor tilted his head. Then, what exactly are you suggesting? Marcus turned toward the screen again. That someone changed the design. The room went still. Richard Carter's expression hardened. Careful, he said quietly. Marcus pointed at the blueprint revision log. That structural change wasn't part of the original design. Emily added quickly, the wind simulation confirms it. The tower's load balance is compromised. Victor folded his arms. And your proof? Marcus tapped the screen. The revision history. The lead engineer stepped forward and studied the log. His face slowly tightened. This modification came late in the project, he said. Victor's voice cut in sharply. Engineering adjustments happen constantly during construction. Marcus turned toward him, but not ones that weaken the structure. Victor smiled again. You're very confident for someone whose job usually involves a shovel. A few quiet laughs moved around the room. Marcus didn't react. Richard Carter spoke again. Marcus, he said slowly, even if what you're saying were true, which it isn't, why would anyone sabotage their own project? Marcus didn't answer immediately, because the truth was simple. Someone inside this company wanted Orion Tower to fail, and if it did, the financial damage would destroy Carter Development. Marcus looked at the blueprint again. Then his eyes moved to the authorization code attached to the revision, the name beside it. He recognized it immediately. Marcus looked up. Who approves financial adjustments during structural revisions? He asked. One executive answered automatically. That would be the CFO's department. Victor's smile froze for a fraction of a second, then returned. Marcus pointed to the screen. The authorization code for this revision came from financial control. The room turned slowly toward Victor. Victor's expression remained calm. Of course it did, he said smoothly. Large construction changes require financial oversight. Marcus studied him carefully. Victor met his gaze, completely unbothered. Then Victor leaned forward slightly. But let me make something very clear. His voice was cold now. You are not an engineer. He gestured toward the door. And you are definitely not part of this company. Richard Carter nodded once. I've heard enough. Marcus looked at Emily. She looked back at him, frustrated. The engineers around the table were whispering quietly now. Something Marcus had said was bothering them. Victor noticed it too, which meant Marcus had already done something dangerous. He had planted doubt. Victor stepped closer. Thank you for your, enthusiasm, Marcus, he said. But Orion Tower was designed by professionals. Marcus said nothing. He simply looked once more at the blueprint, because now he was certain of one thing. The tower had been sabotaged, and the person responsible was sitting in this room. The Lord detests dishonest scales, but accurate weights find favor with him. Proverbs 11:1. The boardroom slowly emptied. Executives gathered their tablets and documents, whispering to one another as they left. The tension Marcus had planted in the room lingered in the air like smoke. Victor Lang was the last to leave. He paused at the doorway and glanced back at Marcus. That thin smile returned. "Interesting presentation," Victor said lightly. Marcus didn't answer. Victor's eyes flicked briefly toward Emily, then back to Marcus. "Just remember something," he added quietly. "Confidence can look a lot like ignorance when it comes from the wrong person." Then he walked out. The door closed behind him. Emily exhaled in frustration. "They didn't listen," she said. Marcus didn't move from the screen displaying the Orion Tower blueprint. "They listened," he replied calmly. Emily frowned. "No, they didn't." Marcus shook his head. "They didn't accept it." He zoomed in again on the revision log. The structural modification sat there like a fingerprint. A small change, but one with enormous consequences. Emily leaned closer. Why would someone sabotage a billion-dollar project? Marcus didn't answer right away, because the real question wasn't why. The real question was who benefits. Marcus studied the authorization code again. The revision had been approved through financial control. Victor's department. Emily followed his gaze. "You think Victor did it?" Marcus crossed his arms. "I think someone used his authority to approve the change." Emily hesitated. "My father trusts Victor," she said quietly. "They've worked together for 15 years. Marcus nodded. "That's why this works." Emily looked at him. "What do you mean?" Marcus turned from the screen. "Sabotage only works when the person responsible is the last one anyone suspects." Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine. She looked again at the tower design. 70 stories, glass and steel rising into the Manhattan skyline. If Marcus was right, the entire structure had a hidden weakness built into its bones. Later that evening, the construction site for Orion Tower buzzed under powerful floodlights. Even at night, crews moved like ants across the massive skeleton of steel beams and concrete floors. Marcus stood at the edge of the site beside Emily. He looked up at the towering structure. The wind pushed through the steel frame with a low, hollow whistle. Marcus studied the upper floors. "See how the frame flexes?" he said. Emily watched carefully. At first, she didn't notice anything. Then she saw it. A subtle shift, almost invisible, but real. "That's the stress point," Marcus said. Emily swallowed. "If the wind pressure increases, the structure starts absorbing vibration," Marcus finished. "Over time, that vibration grows." "And eventually?" Emily asked quietly. Marcus looked up at the tower. "Eventually, something breaks." Emily's stomach tightened. "This building is supposed to open in 4 months," Marcus nodded slowly, "which means construction is moving fast." Emily suddenly remembered something. "Wait!" She grabbed her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen as she opened a message thread from the company's internal planning board. Then her face went pale. "What?" Marcus asked. Emily turned the phone toward him. "The city moved the structural inspection forward." Marcus read the message. "Final inspection scheduled, 72 hours. His jaw tightened. "Why would they move it that soon?" Emily asked. Marcus already knew the answer, because someone wanted the tower approved before anyone discovered the flaw. If the building passed inspection, the sabotage would remain buried. Emily looked up at the towering structure again. "What do we do?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "We need the original blueprint." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus pointed toward the digital plan on her tablet. "This version has already been modified. If we can find the original design, we can prove the structure was altered." Emily nodded slowly. "But where would it be?" Marcus thought for a moment. "Engineering archive." Emily shook her head. "That database was wiped last year when the company upgraded its servers." Marcus turned back toward the tower. "Someone kept a copy." Emily looked confused. "How do you know?" Marcus pointed at the revision log. "Because the change was approved. That means someone submitted it." And engineers don't delete their own records. Emily understood. You think someone saved the original design? Marcus nodded. Someone who knew the change was wrong. Emily thought for a moment. Then one name surfaced in her mind. Daniel Park. Marcus looked at her. Who's that? Senior structural engineer, Emily said. He's worked on Orion Tower since the beginning. Would he keep a backup? Marcus asked. Emily hesitated. Daniel's the type of engineer who documents everything. Marcus looked back at the tower, then up at the higher floors again. Wind pushed through the steel structure. The faint vibration returned. Small, but dangerous. The clock had started. Marcus looked at Emily. We need to talk to Daniel tonight. Emily nodded, but neither of them noticed something happening across the street. Inside a black car parked near the construction site. Victor Lang sat quietly in the back seat. His driver stared forward. Victor watched Marcus and Emily through the tinted window. His phone rested in his hand. A message had already been sent. Security alert. Unauthorized individuals investigating Orion Tower project. Victor's smile slowly returned. They're moving faster than I expected, he murmured. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. Should we stop them? Victor shook his head calmly. No. He looked back at Marcus. Let them run. His eyes narrowed slightly. People chasing the truth usually make the best suspects. Marcus and Emily walked away from the construction site together. Neither of them realized they had already stepped into a trap carefully prepared, and now the countdown had begun. For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light. Luke 8:17. If you've ever discovered that a powerful system was hiding something dangerous, then what Marcus and Emily are about to uncover will shock you. Because the truth behind the Orion Tower isn't just a design mistake, it's a trap. And someone inside Carter Development is already preparing to destroy Marcus's reputation before he can expose it. Stay with Black Resilience Stories, because the next step Marcus takes to find the missing blueprint will push him straight into an ambush. When Marcus finally meets the engineer who holds the original blueprint, security will already be waiting. And the man who saved Emily's life will suddenly become the prime suspect in a billion-dollar sabotage case. Cold wind swept across the unfinished floors of Orion Tower. Steel beams groaned softly as night construction lights bathed the massive structure in white glare. The skeletal frame of the skyscraper stretched into the darkness above Manhattan. Marcus Reed stood near the edge of the construction floor beside Emily Carter. Below them, the city moved like a sea of headlights. Emily checked the time on her phone. He should be here. Marcus nodded once. Daniel Park had agreed to meet them. Reluctantly, Emily had called him 30 minutes earlier, explaining that Marcus believed the tower's structural design had been sabotaged. At first, Daniel refused to talk, but when Emily mentioned the specific brace modification Marcus discovered, Daniel went quiet. Then he said he would come. Marcus looked across the floor as a figure stepped out of the elevator cage. A man in his early 40s approached cautiously. Daniel Park, senior structural engineer for Carter Development. He carried a laptop bag and looked deeply uncomfortable. Emily, Daniel said nervously. Thanks for coming, Emily replied. Daniel's eyes moved to Marcus. You're the construction worker from the boardroom. Marcus gave a small nod. You designed the original support structure for Orion Tower, Marcus said. Daniel frowned. Yes. Marcus pointed toward the upper frame of the building. Then you know the tower wasn't supposed to flex like that. Daniel's expression changed. Emily told you about the wind simulation? Marcus nodded. The brace modification. Daniel inhaled slowly. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he looked down. I knew something was wrong, he admitted quietly. Emily leaned forward. What do you mean? Daniel opened his laptop and pulled up several archived files. The original design distributed wind pressure through a triple support core, he explained. But 3 months ago, I was told the structure had been modified. Who told you? Marcus asked. Daniel hesitated. The request came through financial control. Marcus and Emily exchanged a glance. Victor. Daniel continued. I objected to the change. But the revision was already approved. He turned the screen toward them. On the display appeared the original tower design. Marcus studied it carefully. This version was stable, balanced, exactly the structure he had imagined. Emily felt a surge of relief. "This proves the tower was altered," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. "That's why I kept a backup." Marcus looked at him. "Why didn't you report it?" Daniel's voice dropped. "Because Victor Lang told me if I questioned the revision, my career would be finished." The wind whistled through the steel beams above them. Marcus crossed his arms. "Victor's hiding something." Daniel looked uneasy. "You don't understand how powerful he is inside the company." Marcus said nothing. Instead, he reached for the laptop. "We need to take this to Richard Carter." Daniel hesitated again. "If Victor finds out I gave you those files—" Suddenly, the elevator cage behind them clanged loudly. Marcus turned. Heavy footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. 4 security guards stepped out of the elevator. Behind them walked Victor Lang. His expression was calm, almost amused. "Well," Victor said slowly, "this is quite a meeting." Emily's face tightened. "What are you doing here?" Victor ignored the question. His eyes moved from Daniel's laptop to Marcus. "I've been reviewing some interesting security alerts tonight." He nodded toward the guards. "Apparently someone has been attempting to access restricted company data." The guards stepped closer. Marcus's voice stayed calm. "We were invited here." Victor smiled. "Were you?" He looked at Daniel. "Daniel, did you authorize this meeting?" Daniel froze. Marcus could see the panic in the engineer's face. Victor stepped closer. "You know company policy regarding confidential project files." Daniel swallowed. Victor's voice sharpened. "Did you authorize it?" Daniel lowered his eyes. "No." Emily stared at him. "Daniel?" Marcus understood immediately. Daniel wasn't brave enough. Victor turned back to Marcus. "Well, that settles that." He gestured toward the guards. "This man has been illegally accessing company systems." Emily stepped forward angrily. "That's not true." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Really?" He tapped his phone. Within seconds, one of the guards handed him a tablet. Victor turned the screen toward them. Security footage appeared. Marcus entering the Carter Development Building earlier that day. Then another clip. Marcus studying blueprints inside the boardroom. Victor shrugged. "Looks suspicious." Marcus stared at him. "You planned this." Victor smiled slightly. "No, Marcus." He leaned closer. "You walked into it." He nodded to the guards. "Escort him out." 2 guards grabbed Marcus's arms. Emily stepped forward. "Stop!" Victor's voice remained calm. "You should be careful, Emily." This investigation could easily expand to include anyone helping him. Emily froze. Marcus saw the threat clearly. Victor wasn't just framing him, he was isolating him. Victor turned back to Daniel. "Thank you for your cooperation." Daniel couldn't meet Marcus's eyes. The guards began pulling Marcus toward the elevator. As they dragged him away, Victor spoke one more time. "Oh, and Marcus?" Marcus stopped. Victor's smile widened. "By morning, the news will say you attempted to sabotage Orion Tower." Marcus stared at him. "You're not just covering your tracks," Marcus said quietly. Victor tilted his head. "No." Then his voice dropped. "I'm burying you with them." The elevator doors closed. Marcus disappeared inside. Emily stood frozen in the cold wind. Daniel Park still stared at the floor, and Victor Lang watched the elevator descend, satisfied. Because now the story had changed. Marcus Reed, the man who saved Emily Carter's life, had just become the prime suspect in a billion-dollar sabotage case. The wicked flee though no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. Proverbs 28:1. Morning sunlight poured through the glass walls of Carter Development headquarters, illuminating the city below like a field of steel and light. But inside the building, the atmosphere felt colder than winter. Marcus Reed sat alone in a quiet conference room, his hands resting calmly on the polished table. Across the room, 2 corporate security officers stood near the door. They weren't handcuffing him. Not yet. But they weren't letting him leave either. Through the glass wall, Marcus could see employees whispering outside, phones out, news spreading. He didn't need to read the headlines to know what they said. Construction worker accused in Orion Tower sabotage. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair. Victor Lang had moved fast, but Marcus wasn't panicking, because Victor had made one mistake. He believed Marcus had already lost. The door suddenly opened. Emily Carter walked in quickly. Behind her came Daniel Park. Marcus's eyes moved to Daniel immediately. The engineer looked pale, but determined. The security guard stepped forward. "You shouldn't be here," one of them said. Emily ignored them. "We're meeting with my father." A moment later, the door opened again. Richard Carter entered the room. His expression was hard. Behind him followed several executives and 2 senior engineers. Victor Lang walked in last, completely calm. Richard sat at the head of the table. "I've heard disturbing things this morning," he said. His eyes moved to Marcus. "You're accused of illegally accessing company files." Marcus didn't answer yet. Richard continued. "If that accusation is true, you've put this entire company at risk." Emily stepped forward. "It's not true." Victor folded his arms. "Then I assume you have proof." Emily turned to Daniel. Daniel swallowed hard, then slowly placed his laptop on the table. "I kept a backup of the original Orion Tower design," he said. The room grew quiet. Victor's eyes narrowed, slightly. Daniel opened the file. The blueprint appeared on the large screen. Marcus stood and pointed to the structural core. "This is the original design," he said. "Balanced load distribution, triple reinforcement core." He clicked the next file. The modified design appeared beside it. "The version currently being built," Marcus continued. "You can see the brace moved here." One of the engineers leaned forward. "That modification redirects wind pressure upward." Another engineer nodded slowly. "That's what the simulation showed yesterday." Marcus turned toward Richard Carter. "Someone altered the tower's structure." Richard stared at the screen. His voice was low. "Why would anyone do that?" Marcus answered calmly. "Because if the tower fails inspection or collapses later, Carter Development loses billions." The executives exchanged uneasy looks. Marcus continued. "And whoever bet against your company in the financial market would make a fortune." The room fell silent. Victor finally spoke. "An interesting theory." Marcus turned toward him. Victor smiled. "But it has one problem." He gestured toward Daniel. "This file proves nothing." Daniel stiffened. "It proves the design was changed." Victor shook his head. "No." He walked toward the screen. "It proves someone created a second blueprint." Victor tapped his tablet. Another document appeared on the screen, a server access log. Victor pointed at it. "This is the system record showing who modified the Orion Tower design." Marcus studied the screen. A username appeared. Marcus.read. The room exploded in whispers. Emily stepped forward. "That's impossible." Victor shrugged. "The system doesn't lie." Marcus stared at the log. Timestamp, authorization code, blueprint revision, all linked to his credentials. Victor walked slowly around the table. "You entered our building 2 days ago," he said calmly. "You viewed the project. Files." He nodded toward the log. "And shortly after that, the blueprint modification was uploaded." Marcus understood immediately. Victor had planted the evidence. Victor stopped directly across from him. "You didn't expect us to notice?" Victor asked quietly. Emily slammed her hand on the table. "This is ridiculous!" Victor turned toward her. "Is it?" He nodded toward the security officers. "They traced the login through the building network." Marcus's jaw tightened. Victor had planned every step. Marcus presenting the evidence, the boardroom meeting, even Daniel's backup file. Victor had anticipated it all, and now Marcus looked exactly like what Victor wanted him to be, the saboteur. Richard Carter looked from Marcus to the screen. "Marcus," he said slowly, "did you access our systems?" Marcus held his gaze. "Yes." The room fell silent again. Emily looked shocked. "Marcus," Marcus continued calmly, "I accessed the blueprint files to study the structure." Victor smiled. "And then you changed them." Marcus shook his head. No. Victor raised an eyebrow. The system log says otherwise. Marcus looked at him. The system log says someone used my credentials. Victor's smile widened. So, now you're claiming someone framed you? Marcus didn't answer, because the truth was obvious, but without proof, it didn't matter. Victor turned toward Richard Carter. I recommend we report this to the City Inspection Board immediately. Emily stepped forward. You can't be serious. Victor shrugged. A sabotage attempt on a major skyscraper project isn't something we ignore. He looked back at Marcus. And Mr. Reed should probably speak with investigators. The security officers moved closer. Marcus felt the room shifting. The executives no longer looked curious. They looked suspicious. Victor had flipped the narrative perfectly. Emily looked at Marcus desperately. This isn't over, she whispered. Marcus said nothing. But inside he understood something important. Victor had played his final card too early. Because if Marcus was being framed, then somewhere there had to be evidence showing how. Marcus slowly turned his eyes back to the blueprint screen. And for the first time since the meeting began, Victor's confidence flickered. Just for a second. But Marcus saw it. And that was enough. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. Proverbs 26:27. Silence filled the conference room. The accusation still hung in the air. On the screen behind Marcus Reed, the server log glowed in cold blue light. User access, Marcus.Reed. File modification, Orion Tower structural revision. Victor Lang stood with his hands folded calmly. For a moment it looked like the story was finished. Marcus Reed, the construction worker who dared question a billion-dollar project, had just confessed to accessing the company's system. To the executives around the table, the conclusion seemed obvious. Richard Carter's voice was low. Marcus, he said, this evidence puts you in a very difficult position. Marcus didn't argue. He simply studied the screen. Victor watched him carefully, waiting. But Marcus wasn't panicking. He was observing. Because something Victor had said earlier kept echoing in his mind. The system doesn't lie. Marcus slowly turned toward Daniel Park. Daniel, he said quietly. Daniel looked up. When you downloaded the original blueprint archive, Marcus continued, did you access it from the engineering server or the financial server? Daniel blinked. Engineering. Marcus nodded. Then he pointed toward the log on the screen. This revision came from financial control. The room shifted slightly. Marcus looked at Victor. Why would financial control upload structural revisions? Victor's smile remained. Because large projects require financial authorization. Marcus shook his head slowly. That's not authorization. He tapped the screen. That's direct system access. One of the senior engineers leaned forward. Financial control shouldn't have editing privileges in the engineering database. Victor's voice sharpened. Privileges can be temporarily granted during project audits. Marcus nodded. Exactly. Then he turned toward Richard Carter. And Orion Tower had a financial audit 3 months ago. Richard frowned slightly. Yes. Marcus pointed again at the log. This modification happened during that audit. Victor's expression remained calm, but the room was growing uneasy. Marcus walked closer to the screen. Which means someone used financial audit access to modify the design. Victor folded his arms. And you're suggesting that person wasn't you? Marcus looked directly at him. Yes, Victor chuckled softly. You just admitted to accessing the system, Marcus nodded. I accessed the blueprint files. He paused. But I didn't upload anything. Victor gestured toward the screen. The system log says otherwise. Marcus stepped closer. Then let's look at the full log. Victor's eyes flickered briefly, just for a moment. Marcus saw it. Show the full access chain, Marcus said calmly. The engineer at the computer hesitated. He looked toward Richard Carter. Richard nodded once. Pull it up. The engineer typed quickly. The server log expanded. Multiple entries appeared. Access records, authorization codes, IP addresses. Marcus studied them carefully. Then he pointed at one line. This is my login. The engineer nodded. Marcus moved his finger downward. But the upload happened here. A few seconds later, different authorization code. The engineer leaned closer. That's strange. Victor spoke immediately. System latency, completely normal. Marcus shook his head. No. He looked at the engineer. Check the authorization key. The engineer zoomed in. The code appeared larger on the screen. The engineer's face changed. That's not Marcus's credential. The room fell silent. Marcus spoke quietly. That's a financial master key. Now every eye turned slowly toward Victor. Victor's smile faded slightly. That doesn't prove anything, he said. Marcus continued. Financial master keys override user permissions. He looked at Richard Carter, which means someone with financial control could upload a file using another employee's login. Victor's voice hardened. Speculation. Marcus shook his head again. No. He pointed to another entry in the log. This IP address. The engineer checked it. That terminal is in the CFO's office. The room froze. Emily Carter stared at Victor. Victor remained still. Then he laughed once. You're building quite the conspiracy. Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Daniel. Daniel, he said, open the backup archive again. Daniel obeyed. The original blueprint appeared beside the modified version. Marcus zoomed in on the structural brace. Look carefully at the modification. The engineers leaned forward. Marcus pointed to the metadata embedded in the file. This modification wasn't created by engineering software. The engineer's eyes widened. It came from a financial modeling program. Marcus nodded, which means whoever changed the structure didn't do it for engineering reasons. He turned slowly toward Victor. They did it to manipulate financial outcomes. Emily stepped forward. You mean stock value? Marcus nodded. If Orion Tower failed inspection or collapsed later, Carter development stock would crash. He looked at Richard Carter, and anyone betting against your company would make billions. The room was silent now. Victor's face had lost its calm. Marcus stepped closer to the screen. Check market trading records during the last 3 months. One executive quickly opened a financial dashboard. His eyes widened. There were massive short positions placed against Carter development. Richard Carter leaned forward. By who? The executive scrolled, then stopped. The name appeared. A private investment firm, one controlled through offshore accounts. But the authorization signature attached to the trades was Victor Lang. The room erupted. Executives began speaking over one another. Victor's face went pale. Richard Carter stood slowly. You sabotaged my building? Victor's voice broke slightly. You don't understand, Marcus interrupted calmly. You wanted the tower to fail. He gestured toward the skyline outside the window. $1 billion collapse. Victor shook his head. You think this company would survive the market long enough to prove sabotage? Marcus didn't answer. Because the truth was already clear. The engineers were staring at the evidence. The executives were furious, and Victor Lang had just lost control of the story. Security officers entered the room. Richard Carter pointed at Victor. Remove him. Victor looked at Marcus one last time. His voice was cold. You think you won. Marcus didn't respond. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about the truth. Victor was escorted out of the room. The door closed behind him. Silence returned. Richard Carter looked at Marcus. For the first time since they met, there was no contempt in his eyes, only realization. Marcus turned back to the blueprint. The tower still had a problem, but now the truth was finally exposed, and the clock was still ticking, because the inspection was less than 2 days away. Marcus picked up the marker again and began drawing the structural solution. For nothing is hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. Luke 8:17. The conference room remained silent long after Victor Lang was escorted out. Through the tall glass windows, Manhattan stretched endlessly, steel towers rising into the gray sky. One of those towers stood unfinished among them. Orion Tower, the building Victor Lang had tried to turn into a financial weapon. Richard Carter slowly sat down. For the first time since Marcus Reed walked into his company, the powerful real estate developer looked uncertain. He turned to the engineers. "How bad is it?" Richard asked quietly. One of the senior engineers studied the blueprint on the screen. "The structure can be repaired," she said carefully, "but the modification changed the tower's stress distribution. If we don't correct it before the city inspection, the building will fail certification." Emily looked at Marcus. Marcus was already working. He stood at the glass board, sketching quickly. Steel cores, load paths, wind resistance channels. His rough construction-scarred hands moved with calm precision. The engineers watched, at first with skepticism, then with growing respect. Marcus stepped back and pointed to the drawing. "If we install a secondary brace system here," he said, marking the upper floors, "the load can be redirected back through the central column." The lead engineer frowned. "That would stabilize the harmonic vibration." Another engineer nodded slowly. "And it can be installed before inspection." Marcus turned to Richard Carter. "It will take 2 days of non-stop work." Richard looked at the blueprint, then at Marcus. For a moment, the memory of their earlier conversation seemed to hang between them. "Heroes don't last long in this city." Richard stood. "Then we start immediately." The next 48 hours were relentless. Construction crews worked through the night under blinding floodlights. Steel braces were lifted by cranes and secured deep within the tower's upper structure. Engineers recalculated stress, loads. Marcus moved between crews, checking every connection personally. Emily worked beside him, reviewing structural data and coordinating the engineering team. For the first time since Orion Tower began construction, laborers and executives worked side by side. No titles, no hierarchy, just a race against time. Finally, on the morning of the inspection, the wind simulation was run again. The tower stood still. No dangerous sway. No structural warning. The lead engineer exhaled. "It's stable." Emily smiled with relief. Marcus simply nodded. Later that afternoon, city inspectors walked through the finished structural framework. They studied the revised engineering reports carefully. After nearly an hour, the chief inspector closed his clipboard. "Orion Tower passes structural inspection." A wave of relief moved through the room. Richard Carter turned toward Marcus. The room grew quiet. "Marcus Reed," Richard said slowly, "I owe you more than an apology." Marcus said, "Nothing." Richard continued, "You saved my daughter's life, and now you've saved my company." He extended his hand. "I judged you without understanding who you were." Marcus looked at him, then finally shook his hand. The tension that had defined their first meeting was gone. Richard turned toward the engineers. "Effective immediately," he said. "Marcus Reed will be joining Carter Development as a structural consultant." The room erupted with surprised murmurs. Emily smiled. Marcus looked out through the glass wall toward the skyline. The tower he had helped save stood tall against the afternoon sky, a building that almost became a symbol of greed and sabotage. Instead, it had become something else, proof that truth, courage, and skill could rebuild what deception tried to destroy. And Marcus Reed, once dismissed as just a construction worker, had become the man who saved it. This story is not simply about a skyscraper. It is about two very different men and the choices they made. Marcus Reed, the protagonist, represents quiet strength. He does not begin with wealth, status, or authority. Instead, he carries something far more powerful: discipline, humility, and the courage to stand by truth even when the world doubts him. Marcus never wins by shouting or anger. He wins by observation, patience, and integrity. On the other side stands Victor Lang, the antagonist. Victor represents a mindset that exists in many powerful systems, the belief that intelligence without morality is enough to control outcomes. Victor believed he could manipulate truth, profit from destruction, and hide behind procedures and numbers. But the story shows something deeper. When power is used without integrity, it eventually collapses under its own weight. The deeper message of this story is simple but powerful. Never judge a person by appearance, position, or status. Sometimes the people the world overlooks carry the wisdom that can save it. Real strength is not measured by wealth or titles, It is measured by character. And sometimes the greatest change in a system begins with a single person who refuses to stay silent when something is wrong. If we reflect on this story in our own lives, we may ask ourselves, do we judge people too quickly? Do we ignore truth because it comes from unexpected voices? Do we stand up when something unjust happens? When more people choose courage over silence, the systems around us slowly begin to change. The Bible reminds us again and again that God does not judge the way humans do. In 1 Samuel 16:7, it says, "The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Marcus Reed was underestimated by everyone who saw only his job title. But God often places wisdom, strength, and purpose in the most unexpected people. And when truth finally comes to light, as it always does, it reminds us that integrity will always outlast deception. If this story moved you or made you reflect on the way we see others, then you are already part of the change we hope to inspire. Thank you for watching Black Resilience Stories, a place where powerful stories remind us of dignity, courage, and truth. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can hear these stories of resilience, faith, and justice. Because sometimes, the people the world underestimates are the very ones who rebuild it.